But without further ado, we have another great speaker who is sitting down here, Peter Zeihan, like the national park, he told me. So, but he's a fascinating speaker. He's a geopolitical strategist, and he talks about global energy, demographic, and security. He's a global energy, demographic, and security expert. So he's got a fascinating story to tell. He'll actually explain some of the things that Trump is doing and why he's doing them. I don't think he can fully explain that, but he can try. But it's a fascinating talk. I heard him speak back in October, and with that, I'll turn it over to Peter.
Hey, everybody. It's always a little dangerous to be the guy that goes before the bar opens. I can't guarantee that I'm going to get you there any faster, but I can guarantee you're going to need an extra drink when you do arrive. So, with that, let's talk about the end of the world. Our world begins in New Hampshire. I mean, who knew? You see, before World War II, things worked differently. We didn't have this global trade thing. You were more likely to shoot your neighbors than to trade with them. And if you saw something you thought you needed, you went out and you took it. You colonized it. You militarized it. And you used your navy to guard the shipments between your colony and your mainland. These systems rose into empire. Those empires clashed. They went to war, culminated into World War II, which brought the whole system crashing down. For what? At the end of the war, the Americans were the last ones standing. And they gathered their allies together here at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, where they put on a conference. And what do you do at a conference? You bait people in with a wonderful location, maybe the promise of some golf, then you lock them into a room while some blowhard prattles on about how the world's going to be. You've all been there. At Bretton Woods, the United States laid out the rules for a new age. Instead of everybody having a separate, sequestered, imperial, militarized system, everything would be pooled. Anyone would be able to, under the guise and protection of the American Navy, buy any product from anywhere in the world, ship it home, turn it into a finished product, send that product out to earn export income. For the first time, we had a global system. There was just one catch. You had to pick sides. The Americans bribed up an alliance to fight and win the Cold War. And it worked very well. Global GDP expanded by a factor of 10. The global population tripled. It has been the longest period of peace and prosperity in human history. Unfortunately, the plan had one flaw. We won. Say what you will about the Germans. They may have a slow fuse, but once they do get going, wow, can they party. Now what? The war's over. Then President Bush Sr. put together a team. Dick Cheney, Brent Scowcroft, Colin Powell, sent them off to figure out what's Bretton Woods 2? How do we take this alliance, the greatest alliance in human history, and play it forward for another half-century of engaged American preeminence? And we Americans were so impressed with the accomplishment that we voted him out of office. And in the next 6 consecutive federal election contests, we decisively went with the candidate who celebrated his lack of foreign expertise. The economic aspects of Bretton Woods, the idea that the U.S. is the market of first and last resort, that the U.S. Navy will patrol the global commons, that was all allowed to continue. But the concept that the Americans would get some sort of quid pro quo as a result of this security outlay, that faded away. And the world got weird. We have seen a rise of countries that historically have really been nothing. Places like South Africa or Brazil or South Korea or Poland or India or Russia and, of course, China. What the hell? How'd this happen? Well, it happened because of Bretton Woods. Countries that had never been able to have a significant economic presence all of a sudden could because the security costs were covered by the United States. Trump's got a point. He's got a really solid point. It's Strategically, Bretton Woods is no longer working for the United States. But economically, it was never supposed to. The Americans subsidized the alliance fights the Soviets. That was the deal. Where does the United States fit in this brave new world without the rubric of the Cold War? Well, the short version is we don't at all. And that's okay. Never forget that for the United States, trade was never about economics. It was about security. As a percentage of GDP, the United States remains the least involved economy in the world. As a percentage of GDP last year, less than 8% of our economy came from exports. About half of that is within NAFTA. The U.S. can easily have a regional trade system without maintaining the global system. The big fight back in 2016 wasn't about whether we should or shouldn't engage the world. It was a debate between two people about how fast should we withdraw. Under a President Hillary Clinton, it would have been a relatively slow, orderly withdrawal of 4 to 8 years. It would have been PowerPoint and pamphlets and timetables. Under President Trump, it's happening somewhat quicker, 4 to 8 tweets. But we're getting to the same place. Disengagement. Now let's look at it by locality. The deeper the colors on this map, the more involved that state is in international commerce. Can you see the relationship among these colors and the red-blue breakdown in our political system? Nobody? It's because there isn't one. Trick question. No relationship, no correlation whatsoever between how we run our economies locally and how we filter out international news, which means that the Americans can have a globally devastating foreign policy without a ripple of discussion at home. Let's look at it politically. The reason that the Republicans tend to win the really big elections is that their coalition is more cohesive. So the evangelicals don't want to shut down the Navy, and the national security voters don't care what you do with your personal life. All the factions have a short list of issues that they're really passionate about, but those issues don't contradict each other. So you can build them into a coherent platform, take it to the polls, all the factions show up to vote, it's reliable. They tend to win. That's not how it works with the Democrats. Single mothers don't see why they should have to pay higher taxes to put the millennials through college. Gay Americans and African Americans have radically different concepts over what the term civil rights even means. Unions and Greens disagree on every aspect of industrial policy. Any Democratic candidate that attempts to run on the issues immediately spawns an internecine feud within the coalition, and entire sections of it don't vote. A Hillary Clinton or Michael Dukakis cannot possibly win. But if the Democrats can float a candidate who runs on charisma, papers over the policy differences of Barack Obama and Bill Clinton, they'll walk away with it. Bigger coalition, more voters. And then in the middle, two groups that are kind of hard to nail down. They tend to be socially conservative, but also economically liberal, very squishy. This is how it's been since roughly 1940. For those of you who were not in a coma in 2016, you may recall that's not how things actually went down. Let's break it down. Business community. You guys know campaign finance reform, right? 2016 was the first year where those laws were fully in place at the federal level. We now put people in prison for that sort of stuff. We took the largest chunk of the right alliance and told them they were no longer welcome. National security conservatives, maybe 2 or 3 of those in this room. The military voters, solid Republican voters, until Donald Trump started picking fights with John McCain and Gold Star families. National security voters actually looked at Secretary Clinton as one of the few people within the Obama team that had any concept as to how the world really worked. They became swing voters. Evangelicals, solid right-wing group, until we found out that Donald Trump had been in 2 softcore porn films. You haven't eaten for a while. If you're going to Google that, I guess now is as good a time as any, but you cannot unsee that. Pro-lifers know that Donald Trump was a card-carrying Democrat for 35 years, and the issue that he put most of his money behind when it came to politics was pro-choice groups. They didn't trust him. They didn't show. It's even worse on the left. Black Americans loved Barack Obama. I mean, what's not to love? A 40-something black dude from South Chicago. They were never going to get excited about a 60-something white chick who had already lived in the White House. They barely showed up at all. The socialists in the under 30s, that's the Bernie Sanders crowd, and I gotta admit, I just adore Senator Sanders. He's so reliably and delightfully out of touch. Just the gift that keeps on giving. When the Clinton political machine finally crushed the Sanders campaign and forced Senator Sanders to capitulate live on television in front of his most ardent supporters, a third of the audience walked out on him. To the degree that these folks voted, they didn't vote for Hillary Clinton. Unions, they're opposed to Trump, they supported Trump on his merits. The anti-free trade rhetoric really resonated. The Hispanics were opposed to Trump 8-1 in pre-election polling. How do you possibly come back from that? Come election day, turns out it was only 2-1. Why the split? The pollsters forgot to ask if you were a citizen and were allowed to vote. Relevant detail. And then the Catholics just wanted to take a shower. Here's where we ended up. The two-party system that runs this country, for the moment, is offline. Now, this is normal, healthy even. Technology evolves. The balance of power among the states shifts. Demographics move. Politics moves with it, on a delay. The last time both parties broke down at the same time was the 1930s. Great Depression, World War II, FDR. It took 12 years for the parties to settle into the form we recognize today. Remember that the Republicans used to be the big government pro-regulation party. We don't know what this is going to look like on the other side of this. And talking about the terms Democrat and Republican at all right now is incredibly misleading because there's no factions. There's nothing but factions in Congress right now. It didn't really matter who won. Because whoever did become the president wasn't going to have a party to lead or a party to oppose. It's all just a mess right now. And it will be until this sorts out. It will sort out. It'll just take time. Let's look at it horizontally by slice. For people who were born before 1946, this is probably how they still think of the baby boomers. Those damn liberal hippies that just don't understand. Well, sorry, but they're starting to look a lot more like this these days. The boomers are evolving into get-off-my-lawn conservatives. What about the millennials? They were raised a bit differently. Didn't keep track of the score at soccer games. Went to university where, based on who had the coolest dorms, only took jobs that fulfilled them. But other aspects of life didn't stop. Your oldest millennials turned 38 this year, and on average, they've got 2 kids. And they're discovering that you cannot raise 2 children in a midtown Manhattan apartment on a barista salary. And in droves, they are moving back to their hometowns because they need the free childcare that comes from being directly adjacent to the bank of mom and dad. Life has not turned out the way they promised themselves. That idea that the intern would come out and say, oh, what are you going to do in 5 years? Oh, I'm going to have your job. Yeah, that didn't happen for anyone. They're becoming bitter and angry. The days of pooping and getting a trophy are long gone. And 45% of them voted for Donald Trump. The 2 great progressive generations in American politics, the boomers and the millennials, are descending into narcissistic populism at the same time. And while for the boomers, to a degree, this is expected, you retire, you get a little crotchety, it happens. The millennials are going to be the dominant voting bloc in American politics until the 2070s, and they are establishing lifelong voting patterns right now. Which means that Donald Trump is likely to be the least populist most international, most inclusive president that the United States has in our lives. And if you're a foreign leader and the Americans are abandoning the global order and you have to strike a bilateral deal to get by, it will only get harder. So that's all one, the American back out. Number two is demographics. This is a standard demographic profile. Children at the bottom, young adults, mature adults, retirees at the top. Women on one side, men on the other. Simple mortality builds this into a pyramid. This is India. This is a consumption-led demographic. It's called that because if you're roughly 40 to 45 and under, it's all about the spending. Kids, cars, houses, college, pot, spend. But they're new. Their income has yet to rise to their expenditure needs. So it's car loans, college loans, mortgages. It's high growth. This is most of the modern economy, but it's also very high debt. Fun fact, a system like India's does not necessarily need to be involved in a global system because they can consume most of what they produce. There's a reason why India is always the stickler at the World Trade Organization talks, because they just don't care all that much. Country that does care, South Korea. This is an inverted demography, also known as an investment-led demography. People roughly age 40 to 65, it's not about the spending. The kids have moved on, the house has been paid down. For them, it's all about preparations for retirement. Their incomes are high, consumption is low. All that surplus money goes into investments, well, at least the part that the government doesn't take that forms the tax base. This is the velocity of capital. This is what funds infrastructure and social programs and a defense force. This sort of system has to be part of a global network because there's no way they can consume at home what they produce. And eventually, you can age into something like Japan. Japan faces a strange quandary. It has had to figure out how to make a modern economy work without workers. There's a reason they're the world's leader in automation. One of the fun things about robots is they don't vote. Well, not yet. Which means it doesn't matter where they are. So Japan has made the strategic decision to offload a lot of its industrial plant adjacent not just to end users and end consumers, but to security guarantors. Toyota's top 4 facilities, Kentucky and Texas. Here's the United States. We're kind of in the middle. Let's go through the generations from the top down. Up at the top, the silent generation. These are the people who grew up during World War II and the Great Depression. Their formative political experiences, cultural impacts, the famine in Ukraine, the Chinese Civil War, the Holocaust. They instinctively understand the benefit of a rules-based international order. But because of age, they've largely passed from the scene. They've handed the torch to the baby boomers. Baby boomers are the largest generation as a percentage of the population in American history. And all of those workers in that capital-rich demographic have made the United States capital-rich. Exorbitantly capital-rich, unprecedentedly capital-rich. Too capital-rich. All of those investment dollars chasing the same number of opportunities, supply and demand, has pushed down the cost of capital and forced the baby boomers to search for riskier and riskier investment portfolios in order to get that extra mythical 1% of return before they retire. This has pushed them to put their money into things that in retrospect probably weren't the best idea. This is the brick boom. This is Enron. This is subprime. This is disco. None of this should have ever happened. But by the year 2022, the majority of the boomer money will have to come home because the majority of the boomers will have retired. So all of those prospective investments that have kicked global growth around the world up to unprecedented levels will suddenly get sucked out. The investment boom of the last 15 years will collapse, and all of that money will come back to the United States, where it won't go into the stock market or the bond market. No, that's too risky. it'll go into cash and T-bills. The availability of investment will collapse. The speed of capital, the velocity of capital will collapse. In fact, it'll reverse. The cost of borrowing will go up by at least a factor of 5 in just 5 years. Next down, Gen X, that's my generation, 1974 birth year, smallest birth year in American history. We were born knowing that we were screwed. Because no matter what we did, we were going to be outnumbered. We will not be able to outvote the baby boomers until we are in our 70s. And we know that the baby boomers will never vote for meaningful changes to Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security because they're the beneficiaries. We also know that the millennials won't, because if these reforms were to happen and if payout payments were to be cut, the boomers would have no choice but to move in with their kids. And from the millennials' point of view, that's strictly a one-way experience. They can all agree, however, that Generation X should pay for everything. So we are looking at 75 million retiring boomers relying on 11 Gen Xers. Not 11 million, just 11. Marginal tax rate has to go up by at least 50% as a result. It's going to suck. Until then, however, it's actually pretty good for Gen X. Cost of capital is low, right? I've been able to refinance my house 5 times in the last 6 years. 2.04%. Eat your heart out. It's awesome. But it's temporary. There's a reason that we all listen to Kurt Cobain in order to soothe our fears. I mean, if that's who you're going for solace to, oh yeah, we're messed up. And then we got the millennials, those neurotic, narcissistic, omnipresent millennials. While they do deserve every shovelful of crap that I send their way, and they so do, thank God they're there. 3 big reasons. First, consumption. All those bedazzled flip-flops and all those circulation-constricting jeans and all that fair trade, GMO-free, sugar-free, soy-free, dairy-free, cruelty-free beard butter, it all adds up. Millennial consumption has kept the American system out of recession since 2009. And while there's no guarantees in economic laws, they're probably going to be young and consuming enough to keep us out of recession for another 6 or 7 years. That's not bad. Second, if you play this forward to the year 2030, when the millennials have matured, and define that word however helps you sleep at night, they will fill out the tax-paying class in a way that Gen X never could. So there is a light at the end of the tunnel. It is not a train. It's just a millennial with the new eye boxers or whatever they're called. And then finally, if you look at the rest of the world, there was a baby bust starting in 1970 to 1980 based on where you were. And if you look at the combined demography of the rich world without the Americans in it, it's an old folks' home. So today, courtesy of the millennials, the United States is the world's top consumption power. And courtesy of the boomers, the United States is the world's top investment power. But by the year 2030, it's the only consumption power and only investment power. We are in the midst of the Great Transition. The United States is becoming the only country that can possibly, even theoretically, absorb global exports. At the same time, it's lost all political, economic, and strategic interest in doing so. Final piece, the shale revolution. The broader the bar, the greater the volume of crude oil production. OPEC is there on the right in black. The taller the bar, the greater the cost of producing that crude. And this is everything from exploration on the front end to transport infrastructure on the back end. This is back from 2012. Shale is there in light blue on the far left. Back in 2012, shale was not a big deal. But there's been a series of technological breakthroughs that are working their way through the system. Here's where we were as of 3 weeks ago. The United States and Canada became net oil exporters in the 4th quarter of last year. 2 years from now, these technologies that I was mentioning, they will have pushed down that blue bar below $25. Energy independence is not some hazy future issue. Functionally, it has already happened, and that changes the way Americans look at the world. This is a political heat map from the height of the Cold War, 1985. Deep blue, that's the front yard and the backyard, countries that the Americans were willing to fling nukes to defend. Medium blue, that's the core Bretton Woods system. Orange, those are the other guys. We don't like to talk about them. Light blue is the field of competition. It was a global fight. Everything mattered. Everything had consequence. Now remove energy dependence, change the way the Americans define security in the alliance. Here's where we're about to be. And just because it's orange on that map doesn't mean it's a problem for us. It's just a problem for someone. There's a lot of gray up there, a lot of places that the Americans just don't have a strong opinion on. And if you remove the United States from maintaining the system and let the chips fall where they may, it is up to local countries, whether out of desperation or opportunity, to chart their own course, to look out after their own interests. That will trigger dozens of brushfire wars, 3 of which have global consequences. The first involves the Russians. Post-Cold War, there was a 60% drop in the birth rate. If the Russians are going to use military tactics in an attempt to reshape their world, now's their last chance. And so they're doing it, which means you have to look at the world from their point of view. The red on this map is areas of ethnic Russian majority populations. The other colors aren't empty, it just means that it's not dominated by ethnic Russians in that zone. Now, in the western periphery of this red zone, you've got a series of huge geographic barriers that make Kansas look hilly. It's wide open, easy to march across. Just ask the Germans. Usually people don't laugh at that one, thank you. As the Russian thinking goes, defending this frontier with the current army is impossible, much less with the army they're about to have. But if the Russians can afford to play their rapidly shrinking forces into these 5 arcs, 2,000 miles of wide open terrain drops down to about 450 miles of constrained access. The problem for the rest of the world is that this is the Russian oil export network. That's 7 million barrels a day of crude. That if it goes offline, going through war zones usually makes things go offline, that's enough for a global energy-induced depression a decade in duration, minimum. War II, Persian Gulf. Now, the reason that the Persian Gulf has been so calm for the last 40 years, and just kind of marinate in that for a moment, it's Bretton Woods. We keep a carrier battle group in the Gulf at all times to make sure that the oil can flow. Not to us, the oil flows to the trade order. The trade order powers the security alliance. The alliance gives us our security. But we now define our security differently. We're no longer using the alliance. We've never used the trade, and courtesy of shale, we don't even really care about the oil. Every link in the chain of logic that has kept the United States bound to this region for the past generation has more or less broken in the last year and a half. That leaves it to the local players to figure out who's in charge. Lo and behold, some of them have some really strong opinions on that. The 2 countries that matter the most are the Saudis and the Iranians. But we're a largely American audience here, right? We're all a little sick of hearing about the Mideast, so let me just kind of sum it up this way. Think of it like the struggle between the University of Texas and Texas A&M, just with more guns. Well, with more guns that people actually use. And like all the world's truly great rivalries, eventually fans end up in the wrong bar. So down here at Kyle Field, you have the world's largest oil-producing asset, the Ghawar Superfield. Living in College Station are 2.5 million religious Shia in a Sunni theocracy. Up here at the UT Tower, you have 3 million ethnic Arabs in a Persian ethno-linguistic state that just happen to live on top of 80% of Iran's oil and natural gas output. The intelligence authorities on both sides are burning the midnight oil, attempting to spawn revolutions in the opposing zones, working from the very accurate assessment that if you can crush the oil income, you've crimped the country. That's 11 million barrels per day, assuming nobody gets caught in the crossfire. So what do those wars look like? Well, War I with the former Soviet Union, here we have basically a population density map. You'll notice that everything north of this line is pretty empty, whereas everybody lives south of it. North of it, you get an air war that the Russians cannot possibly lose until they get to the coast. And then they face the Scandinavian navies and special forces teams, and it becomes an irregular amphibious warfare versus a dominating air presence. It'll be ugly, but it's the kind of war that both sides are really good at fighting. South of that line, we get a German-Russian redux on the northern European plain. Ugly, brutal, urban. It's a little bit cleaner in the Persian Gulf, if you can believe it. Issue with the Persian Gulf, again, is the Ghawar superfield right there. If the Iranians can make it there, the game is over. Because not only will they have taken the oil offline, they'll control the infrastructure that leads to all of Saudi Arabia's major cities. And there's no way that the Saudis could possibly fight back at that point. Anybody ever wonder why the Saudis invaded Yemen without ground troops? Anybody ever wonder why they're bombing urban areas without time-on-target ground-based intelligence with precision-guided munitions? It's practice. This red zone, that's the desert barrier between the infrastructure in Kuwait and the infrastructure in Ghawar. It's about 300 miles of desert. They're getting ready for the grand Iranian-Turkey shoot. War III. You change the oil flows out of the Persian Gulf, you change the oil flows out of the former Soviet space, and everything changes. This is how oil used to get shipped in 2007. The big demand centers were Western Europe and North America. They would take whatever they could get from anywhere. Anything that was left over would go to East Asia. 7 years into the shale revolution, the Americans learned how to get by without 7 million barrels per day of imports. The Europeans had a catastrophic financial crisis, and they saw their own demand plummet, which meant if you were a producer of crude anywhere in the world, your only option was to send it to East Asia. All of a sudden, the East Asians got pricing power. But now throw a crisis in the Persian Gulf and the former Soviet space, and the arrows move again. The Americans largely exit stage left. They don't care. The Europeans can't afford to use Russian crude anymore for strategic reasons, so they have to dust off their old imperial playbooks. They have to go back and re-interface with their former colonies in order to keep their lights on. Some of those interfaces will be less gentle than others. And if you are China or Japan or Korea or Taiwan, your only option is to take your navy, sail to the Persian Gulf, pick sides in a centuries-old blood feud, load up the crude yourself, and convoy it home, hoping that no one gets in the way, because there's no longer enough left for everyone. Now, if this were anywhere else in the world, I'd be worried. But if there's anything at all we know about Korea and Japan and China and Taiwan, is that they've got a centuries-old history of brotherly love and cooperation, and nothing could possibly go wrong. Right. The places where the fighting is going to be most intense are the South China Sea. The Japanese don't have to use it. The Japanese have a deep water, blue water navy. They can avoid the whole region. But the Chinese cannot. The Chinese are locked in by the first island chain. Those blue lines represent the major shipping routes for Persian Gulf crude to the Chinese mainland, which means that they have to push south into the South China Sea to at least get partway closer to their end destination. And that means, among other things, seizing control of the two major ports in the region, Subic and Kamran. Without those, there is no Chinese power projection. And remember that in relative and absolute terms, the Chinese are now 3 times as dependent on foreign energy imports as Japan, and they're so much more vulnerable. There will be a war. It will be brutal, but it'll probably be brief because the Japanese can interrupt the supply lines 5,000 miles away and be fine. That means we get a hot shooting war in these zones where maritime traffic isn't simply a casualty, it's a target, an express target. That's 3/4 of global energy shipments, 3/4 of global manufacturing supply steps, 3/4 of global agricultural shipments. It's nothing less than the end of the world that we know. What does all that have in common? The Americans don't really care. It's not their trade, it's not their oil, it's not even their allies. We'll have a split in energy markets. With the speed of a tweet, the oil export ban will come back into place. We get a functional ceiling in North America of $60 to $70 a barrel. You get a functional floor everywhere else of $150. Competitive advantage. You get a break in agricultural markets, with the United States far and away being the world's largest agricultural exporter. Oh wait, we're that already. It just gets better. And you get the massive, massive retooling of the industrial plant that started 3 years ago as manufacturing moves back to North America to take advantage of cheap energy, local rule of law, and a local consumption base that is still the largest in the world. We're not backing away because we're cold. We're not even backing away because we're ignorant. We're backing away because we're insulated. The tan area on that map, that's the greater Midwest, largest chunk of arable land in the world. And as important as its agricultural prowess is, and it is important, it's really the blue lines that make all the difference. Moving things from A to B is kind of a bitch, but if you can float it, it's 1/12 the cost. The Greater Miss by itself is 13,000 miles of naturally navigable interconnected waterway. The Greater Miss by itself is more miles of internal waterway than the combined waterways of the rest of the planet. In addition, deserts and mountains to the south, lakes and forests to the north, ocean moats on either side. Our chunk of North America isn't just the richest territory in the world, it's the most securable. Decades of bipartisan effort have yet to screw this up. And we're not going to figure out how to in the next few years. You can't say the same anywhere else on the planet. Let's start with the Chinese. It's the country that most people typically worry the most about. This area, the North China Plain, this is the Chinese heartland. But you guys have all played Risk, right? You know how no one wants to start in Asia because they can come at you from every direction? That's northern China. No internal barriers. So when the Han ethnicity emerged, they were not the only ones in this area. And it took 2,500 years of ethnic cleansing and warfare for them to basically wipe out everybody else and become the single ethnicity that rules China that we know today. This is the land of the militarists, the politicos, the nationalists. You move down into central China, you get something different. The Yangtze is one of the world's great waterways, 2,000 miles long. When we think of a successful industrialized China, this is what we're thinking of, Shanghai. This is the mercantilists, the manufacturers. And if you go further south, you get something even more different. You get into the tropics. Rough territory, difficult to run infrastructure through. And the same thing happens to a Brit that goes into the Niger Delta, or an American that goes into Honduras, to a northern Chinese citizen who moves into southern China. They get bit by strange bugs they never heard of before. They start bleeding horrible colors, and then they die. It's a disease belt. Northern militarists, central industrialists, southern secessionists. How do you get all these people to be on the same side? Well, there's kind of two things you can do. Number one, you can beat the crap out of anyone who steps out of line. It's a national security state. It will never be a democracy. Option number two, you bribe everybody so they don't feel a need to step out of line. You take all of the savings of all of the population, force them to put that money into the state banks, use the money in those banks to divvy out loans to absolutely any company, not if they've got a business plan, not if they're profitable, not if they've got a product, as long as they can employ people. Because if everybody has a job, they're not all getting together in large groups and going on long walks together. Because that's how the Politburo got their job. They don't like to see that. That generates its own problem. Now, right here in 2007, that was the year of American subprime, right? That was the most overcredited year in our history. In 2007, total in absolute value, Chinese lending surpassed total American lending. Their economy was less than 1/3 the size of ours in that year. It then tripled in the next 18 months because of the financial crisis. People stopped buying Chinese exports, but the Chinese couldn't actually stop production because that would mean laying off people. Looks like they kind of got it under control, but no, now we just have this thing called shadow financing, which is everything from illegal hedge funds to loan sharking. You guys all remember the Obama stimulus package? $800 billion, 3% of GDP over 2 years. There was a lot of concern among economists that the U.S. just couldn't metabolize that much money that quickly without a lot of fraud. Reasonable concern. This is an Obama stimulus package every 17 days now. Will you get growth this way? Sure. But it's not healthy. It's not sustainable. And if anything ever happens to the punch bowl, you get Enron on a national scale. We're going to skip that one because of time. I love this. 25 years after the one-child policy, they're running out of 25-year-olds. The Chinese are not nearly as good at math as they would have us believe. Now, you may have heard a couple of years ago the Chinese went from a one-child policy to a two-child policy. Riddle me this. How long does it take to raise a 25-year-old? Those of you who are parents, don't help the others. There's a lot of understanding back in China that things are going from bad to worse very quickly. This is foreign direct investment going both ways. So in orange, that's FDI going from the United States to China. And at the early part of this graph, it's about what you would expect. Money from the United States going into China to take advantage of the lower labor costs. In recent years, the Chinese have caught up. They're the blue. That's Chinese money going into the United States. Or at least that's how it was until the year 2016. This is not the culmination of a decades-old master plan by the Chinese to dominate the United States and force us to all learn Mandarin. No. This is Chinese business people getting their money the covfefe out of town while they still can. And a lot of what we've seen politically and economically in the last year in China is about cracking down on this sort of activity. And I got loads of anecdotes later if you guys want to hear them about how Chinese get their money out. Rutabagas are my favorite. There's a security issue coming. The green bars on the far left, that's net oil exports. The red bars on the far right is net oil imports. You'll notice how conveniently far apart they are. It's a 7,000-mile sail from Gawar to Osaka. This line is how most of that oil is currently shipped from the Persian Gulf to East Asia. Now, the Japanese and the Chinese both have multiple weapon systems that are eminently capable of interrupting that line at a number of points. But if shipments start to use this route, the Japanese Navy can operate beyond the island chain and operate globally if they need to. They can still protect their shipments. The Chinese can't do that. And they know it. And so what we've seen is a cavalcade of world leaders coming to the United States trying to figure out how they fit in with the Americans in this new era. And Shinzo Abe gets it. He was the second world leader to visit Trump. He doesn't need the United States to be on Japan's side in the war. It would be nice, but it's not essential. And he understands the new transactional nature of American foreign policy. And so in order to solidify the relationship, he brought with him a $500 billion bribe. Investment from the Japanese central government into American infrastructure and industrial plant. $500 billion. Is it enough? Don't know. Good start. Definitely understands how it works. Back in China, their way around this, or way to try to cope with this, is to establish a cult of personality. Make sure that enough major leaders whose names people recognize are executed live on television so that your average citizen looks up and says, you know what? It doesn't matter if I've got a job. It doesn't matter if I can feed my family. President Xi is my leader. I am Han Chinese, and that is enough. Back in November, the Communist Party met here at the Great Hall of the People. The way politics works in China is you serve as president for 5 years. The Congress meets, you nominate your successor, You serve for another 5 years, and it's a transition period to the new guy. Last November was the halfway point. Xi was supposed to name his new successor, and he did. He named his heretofore unheard-of identical twin brother. For those of you who missed that, he also put his name into the Constitution. And the debate right now is, should we just go ahead and make it official and remove term limits? That's what the West would do, I guess. But it's already done. We have a cult of personality officially now. He is president for life. But that doesn't mean he doesn't recognize risks. In fact, I would argue that the political consolidation is because of all the economic and strategic challenges that the Chinese face. And so President Xi was the fifth world leader to come and visit Donald Trump to seek a new bilateral understanding. And he reached ahead and said, I don't want to meet in the White House, because in the White House, the press corps will be there. The State Department will be there. And I need to have a conversation with you that I can't allow out yet. So they met at Mar-a-Lago. And while there, Xi said, very simply, you hold all the cards that matter in this relationship. You control the global sea lanes, the global financial world, the global markets, global energy, all of it. We're working through a transition that might kill us. Please, please, please do not pull the rug out from under us, especially not now. In exchange, let's talk about the trade deficit, South China Sea, North Korea, cybercrime, all of it. And we made more progress in bilateral relations in the next 10 months than we have in the previous 3 presidential administrations. Is it enough? Hell no. But it's a start. And it was an interesting tip of the hand. And if you ever think that you've had a really bad day, consider Xi's position. The stability, strength, and continuity of his government, his country, his person is now wholly dependent upon the even-keeled mood of the man on the left. I don't worry about this. On a not nearly as cheery topic, let's talk about Europe. Northern European plain is the second great capital zone in the world, 11 major rivers transecting the plain. This is where the industry is. This is where economic development is cheap and technological development is possible. This is the major population zone. It's big in investment and consumption and industry, all of it. World class. You leave that zone and Europe kind of goes to hell. You get into islands, you get into mountains, peninsulas, dry zones, highlands, places where development is expensive, it's difficult, it's laborious, and it's hard to maintain. One of the great mistakes the Europeans have made is the euro. Politically, I get it. They wanted to make another war among the European powers unthinkable. I applaud the goal. The humanitarian in me, the politician in me thinks it was wonderful. The economist in me thinks it's the dumbest thing he's ever heard of. Because they took Southern Europe, where development's expensive and difficult, and merged it financially with Northern Europe, where it's cheap and easy. And every month since the euro has come into existence, jobs and industrial plant have been wholesale lifted from the south and moved to the north where it's more effective. With every day the euro continues to exist, the periphery falls further and further behind. The ones that matter the most are the men in the middle, the Germans. There are 4 navigable riverways there. It's the densest capital footprint in the world. The problems that the Germans have is their location. They're right in the middle of the Northern European plain. And there's 8 significant powers hard on their borders. The Germans have traditionally dealt with this by being better. They can never outnumber everyone else, so they just have to do better. So it's better financing, better infrastructure, better educational system, stronger workforce, better industrial plant. You take anything as good as Germany and make it as big as Germany, and its mere existence, though, is a threat to everyone around it. And so European history is a pendulum that swings between periods of extreme German strength when it threatens to overwhelm all of its neighbors economically, politically, doesn't matter. That forces a coalition of European powers to tear it down, which leads to a period of extreme German weakness, at which point everybody gets sucked into the black hole that then becomes Central Europe. The only way that you can stop the pendulum and hope for something better is to bring in an outside force that rewrites what's possible, that changes the laws of the region so that war is no longer legal, that indirectly subsidize everybody's system so they don't have to defend themselves. You have to bring in the Americans. You have to put in Bretton Woods. And then, and only then, can Europe be united at peace and free. You remove the United States, though, and history starts back up. And so Angela Merkel was the third world leader to come to seek new bilateral understandings with the incoming administration. And she said, Mr. President, do you realize that if you do what you say you are going to do, that is not just the end of NATO and of the European Union, that is the end of Germany itself? His response? Merkel didn't understand the new bilateral nature of American foreign policy. The new transactional nature. She didn't bring anything to the table. She was just coming to ask for the United States to continue doing what it had been. And so on her way out the door, Donald Trump gave her a parting gift, a bill for services rendered for defending Germany since 1946. You can imagine how well that went over back in Berlin. For all intents and purposes, the American-German, American-European, the American-NATO relationship is already over. And it couldn't happen at a worse time, because Europe has the worst demography in the world. On the left is Italy. This is why the European financial crisis will end in catastrophe, because consumption-led growth is now absolutely impossible. This is a terminal demography, because you cannot get people in their 50s to generate kids like they're teenagers, not even in Italy. On the right, you've got Germany, which is actually worse. Now, have you guys heard what's going on with Deutsche Bank? One of Europe's most stable, largest, most prestigious financial institutions is on the rocks. This is why. Think about how banks make their money. It's about the spread between the cost of the funds and the cost of the loans. No people in their 20s and 30s means few loans. 0% interest rates means no spread. Small spread, fewer loans, that's how banks die. It's not that I think that Deutsche Bank is the face of Europe's future. I think that Deutsche Bank is probably the best case scenario. You guys have all met Germans. You know, they're pretty good at things like, numbers, accounting. Italians? No. Deutsche Bank's just being honest. Give you an idea of how bad it is. Oops. Non-performing loans. These are bank loans that have gone dud and have gone into foreclosure. Now, in the United States, we are right here at about 2% of our total loan stock has gone bad. This line here is 5%. In the United States, if your bank hits a 5% threshold, the FDIC comes in, closes the bank down, breaks up the assets, distributes them to other financial institutions for remediation, and you're just done. In Europe, the yellow bars are Eurozone countries as a whole. You can see that there's a number of them that are a lot higher than us and a few that are dangerously so. Italy's there in red. Here's the fun bit. That red bar doesn't use US definitions for NPLs. Here, if you're 31 days late, you're in arrears, you get a warning. If you're 91 days late, you go into foreclosure. That's a non-performing loan, 91 days. In Italy, if you're 271 days late, but you've made a partial payment, you're in good standing. That uses that definition. In relative terms, the bad loan stack in Italy today is 80 times that of US subprime at the height of the subprime crisis. There is not enough money on the planet to fix that. By the way, if you're a China watcher, China doesn't issue non-performing loans. They haven't since like 2004. It's a decree they made. They're all good. I love China. Theresa May was the first world leader to visit. She says, Donald, can I call you Donald? Of course I can call you Donald. I'm British. Brexit is a done deal. We're leaving. We still have to work out all the details, but there's no going back, which means we have to do a few things differently in London. First, we have to double our diplomatic and intelligence budget because we can't rely on information from the Europeans any longer. In fact, in many ways, they're the target. We would like to share all of that information with you. Second, we have 2 super carriers that will be coming online in the next few years. They will be the only super carriers on the planet that are not American flagged. We would like to explore with your Navy how we can plug them into your pre-existing battle groups so that the Anglo-Alliance can have a solid, single, strategic policy the world over. And Trump's like, oh, well, this is huge. What can I possibly do in exchange? So we could really use a free trade deal, bilateral. Done. They started talks the next day. Fun fact, that's illegal in the European Union. The European Commission, that's their executive branch, has sole authority to negotiate all trade pacts on behalf of all members, even those that have a foot out the door. So all the talk in Brussels these days is about not just how to punish the Brits for leaving, but how to punish them for having the audacity to plan for the next day. This is not only is this not wise, I'm just kind of like, really? It's like, don't you have a few other things on your plate right now? Like, for example, a currency crisis, a banking crisis, a governing crisis, a German coalition crisis, a Russia crisis, a Ukraine crisis, a Syria crisis, a Turkey crisis, and you're drowning in amber waves of refugees, but you want to bitch about Britain right now? This is not what I would call an institution that can adapt in times of extreme change. And it doesn't have a lot of time left. I want to close out with Mexico because this is the country that I think is going to be generating the biggest security problem for us, but perhaps not in the way you're thinking. So first of all, I think Mexico is going to be one of the fastest growing economic systems in the world for the next 50 years. They're not part of the global trade order. They're just really linked to the United States and Mexico. So they don't have to worry about any of that. 4 big reasons. First of all, the shale revolution, not theirs, ours. One of the side effects of our shale revolution is it's producing huge amounts of natural gas as a waste product. Now, we are using a lot of that natural gas to overhaul our petrochemical space. It has driven electricity prices in the United States down for 7 years running. And we still have a lot of extra. So our number one way to get rid of it is to ship it by pipeline to Mexico. These are the pipelines that are online right now. All of them have come online and finished up within the last couple of years. They will all hit full capacity within another 24 months. At the dawn of the shale revolution, we sent Mexico 1 BCF a day of natural gas. Within 2 years, we'll be sending them 12 to 13. So about half of all the electricity generated in Mexico will be derived from an American fuel. Kind of cool. That's an end to their power problems. Second, labor costs. Here are some Southeast Asian countries that I think are going to do very well in the days to come. Here's Mexico right in the middle, very competitive, and there's China. One-child policy, people. Mexican labor is now half the cost and more highly skilled. They've already had over 4 million jobs reshore in the last 5 years. We've had 1. Third, demographics. It's young. These advantages will last. And they're becoming a consumption-led economy in their own right. And then finally, the drug war, which from an economic point of view is quite possibly the best thing that has ever happened to the country. I got to walk that back. People primarily take advantage of the Mexican market not for consumption purposes, although that's changing, but to leverage the cost differential between American labor costs up here and Mexican labor costs down here. Anything that widens that gap, like, say, a mass beheading, is really good for business. Sounds a little ass backward, but it holds. There's a direct correlation between the violence level and the investment level. There, of course, is a downside to the drug war, and that's the drug part. This is circa 1985, height of the cocaine trade. It would flow up out of the Caribbean coasts of Venezuela and Colombia. It would avoid Cuba like the plague because the Cubans would shoot you on sight if you were moving drugs, and into Miami. You guys all remember Miami Vice, right? Hookers and blow, great family show. Yeah, good times. There's a reason why every episode ended on a down point. Local law enforcement, local resources combating a transcontinental economic phenomenon. Of course they were going to lose. But then the Cold War ended, and the U.S. started to redeploy. And we started shooting down small planes that were flying 10 feet over the water at night with no lights on. The smugglers changed their routes. They went onshore into places like Central America and southern Mexico, and then wound their way through mountain valleys in Mexico highlands up to the U.S. border. Mexico isn't the Midwest. You know how if you're in the Midwest, where are my Midwesterners? There's got to be a few of you in here, right? Yeah, straight roads, we like those, don't we? Yeah, so if you're on a county road in the Midwest and you hit a roadblock or construction or whatever, you just back up, you go to the next county road, and you continue on your merry way. You've lost like 10 minutes. You do that in the Mexico highlands, you have to go all the way back down to the base of the mountains and find another pass to go through. It can take weeks. And what would happen is organized crime groups in those choke points would take a piece of the drug trade and use that money to arm, to bribe locals, to go to war with their neighbors, or to co-opt their neighbors. And they'd expand their influence up and down those lines until they became cartels. Well, then the cartels went to war, and we got the Mexican drug war. As of about 8 years ago, this is kind of what it looked like. It was a very shifting mass. These are the 7 big cartels. The area in the middle there with the hash, those are zones where at least 3 different cartels were fighting out for supremacy. Believe it or not, the cartel wars were actually a good sign because it pushed up the cost of drugs and meant that a lot less of it made it to our shores. But as with all wars, eventually someone wins. And by the time we got to 2015, there were really only 3 big coalitions left. The ones that matter the most are there on the left, the Sinaloa, the pink. Now, the Sinaloa was run differently. They weren't a normal organized crime group. It wasn't anything like the Sopranos. It was more like Samsung. They'd get all the regional leaders together, and El Chapo, the leader, would lay down the law. He's like, you're going to all cooperate with each other. You're not going to shoot at each other. If you have a disagreement, you bring it to me, we'll work it out. You're not going to kidnap and engage in petty crime in the locality, because that just pisses people off. And we want them pissed off at other people, not us. We are drug runners. We are not extortionists. Act like it. Dress the part. But I do encourage you to diversify your activities. We're a corporation. And a guy in the back was like, oh, Mr. El Chapo, sir, I think that there's a problem with our business model. We get all of our drugs from South America, we shuttle them up through Mexico, we dodge all the other cartels, and we get them to the United States. We don't control the whole supply chain. We need our own local source. So I would like to propose that we grow some heroin. And he's like, you can't grow heroin in Mexico. We don't have the terrain for it. We don't have the climate. He's like, well, I think with some Roundup and some irrigation and a little fertilizer, we can make some parts of northwest Mexico, a bit of a heroin belt. And I'd like to try it. So he got a grant, and he went and he tried it. And a couple of years later, he's like, I did it. We've got heroin now. It's really crappy heroin. It's black tar heroin. It's not fit for a dog, and the Americans won't touch it because they are really snooty about their heroin. So at the next company meeting, he's like, okay, Bob here has figured out how to make heroin, but nobody wants it north of the border. Anybody have any ideas? And a chemist from the other side of the alliance is like, well, we could take it and put it into counterfeit oxycodone pills and then sell it to Midwestern housewives. The opioid epidemic in the United States is totally homegrown. The fatalities are not. That is largely because of counterfeit pills, and that is largely because of the Sinaloa. The reason I wanted to talk about this is because the Sinaloa proved so successful as a corporation that they became not only the single largest drug trafficking organization in Mexico, they became the largest organized crime group in the world and in the United States. The orange is their territory. Say what you will about the Obama administration. They realized this was a public safety and health threat. They prioritized it with the FBI. And the FBI made cranking down on the Sinaloa their top priority. And in 2016, we got El Chapo. And then we lost him, and then we got him again. here's the problem. Removing El Chapo, the guy who maintained the peace, meant that all of the factions within the Sinaloa are now shooting each other again. The violence level has already spread to the border, where it's entrenched in Tijuana and Juarez, where it can be heard from San Diego and El Paso. And probably in about 6 or 7 weeks, it will have made it to Laredo as well, which means that all but one of the major plazas on the border will have active intercartel fighting. Just in time for our midterm primaries. There are 34 seats in the Senate that are up for grabs. 25 of them are being defended by Democrats. 10 of them are in states that Trump won. I think there's going to be a blowout at the midterms. I don't think it's going to break the way that the Democrats think. The problem from an international point of view, from my point of view, is that just as the United States is picking its candidates for this electoral bout, we're going to be very well aware of the level of violence in Mexico. And so voices that are anti-trade, anti-Mexican, are going to be very well represented in the debate. I'm not saying that they're going to sweep the midterms or anything like that. It's too hard to tell right now. But the voices will be there at the worst possible time. Guess what else happens in May? The NAFTA accords are supposed to be submitted to Congress for ratification. So if you're in favor of NAFTA, or if you're in favor of the drug war getting back under control, this is really bad timing. Except for this guy. This smug bastard is Obrador, Mexican politician. He combines the blind ideology of Ted Cruz, the corruption of Hillary Clinton, the shrillness of Elizabeth Warren, the anti-foreigner sentiments of Donald Trump, and the pathological refusal to engage in basic math of Bernie Sanders. All in one guy. He's in first place because he's running on an anti-Trump campaign. And if you think relations between the United States and Mexico are kind of dicey right now, holy crap. If this guy wins, their presidential elections are June 1. Look out. All right, I'm over time. If you're looking for a coaster or perhaps a doorstop, the left is accidental. That's the shape of the world, how we got to where we are, where we're going. The next one, absent, that's the new guy, starts with the shale revolution, plays it forward, shows how it's remaking the American industrial space and the wars that will erupt around the world because of them. You don't need to read them. You don't even need to buy them. But if everyone could go onto Amazon like right now and review them, that would be phenomenal. All right. Thank you.
Do we have any questions for Peter?
Got a couple over there. And I'll be sticking around through the fun and the party later, so if you've got questions you don't want to ask in front of other people, you'll have your chance.
Let's talk about North Korea.
Let's talk about North freaking Korea. Rocket Man! All right, I got a slide for that just for this sort of emergency. Okay. This is ultimately what we're worried about, right? That dotted orange line is where we currently believe the North Koreans could theoretically hit a missile, right? It covers basically the whole continental United States. I guess if you're in Miami, you're safe, but you know, you're then in Miami, so whatever. Okay. There's a number of things to keep in mind here. First, technically, just because you can launch it that far doesn't mean you can do it reliably. 2, just because you have a nuke doesn't mean you can miniaturize it. 3, just because you can miniaturize it and put it on the missile doesn't mean it can survive re-entry. 4, just because it can survive re-entry doesn't mean you can hit within 20 miles of what you would like to hit. All the easy stuff about a nuclear program, he has now achieved. He is, congratulations, up to 1950s American technology. It was silly of us to think he couldn't reach that far. Now he's got to do the hard part. This is not something that I consider a danger in the next 6 months. 6 years? Maybe. He is Korean. Koreans are clever. But not 6 months. So that's point 1. Point 2, you need to understand what's going on in North Korea. And I'm going to give you my best guess. It's kind of a collection of best guesses. Because anyone who says they really know is lying, because everyone's spies have been killed. Even China's. So what I'm about to share with you is kind of the collective best guess of the Chinese, American, Japanese, Russian, Canadian, British, French, and German intelligence societies. Back in 1993, this guy, Kim Il-sung, the grandfather of the current leader, the guy who fought the Japanese in World War II, slipped in the shower and fell on some bullets. In the previous year, the Soviet Union hadn't just fallen, it had collapsed. It was over. The Americans and the Chinese had gotten together, agreed to put Tiananmen Square behind them and move forward. And he knew that there was no place for Stalinist backwater in the world that was emerging. So he had reached out to the South Koreans, and 3 days after he died, he was supposed to be in Seoul working out the practical mechanics of reunification. And so his generals, knowing that no matter what Korea looked like when it was unified, it wasn't going to need as big of an army, they killed him. They transferred power to this guy. You remember him? Kim Il-sung, second generation. The technical term for his mental state is batshit crazy. I don't like to denigrate the mental capacities of world leaders. They just see the world differently because they have a different point of view. This guy was nuts. He was raised in North Korea, drank the Kool-Aid, bought in. His economic reforms are the ones that caused the famine that killed 25% of the population, which is, in percentage terms, the biggest man-made famine ever. And the first generation stood back and they're like, oh my God, this is totally not what we meant. We're so sorry. So they sent the third generation, this guy, out to study. And not just him, his whole cadre, hundreds of them. The idea being that at some point in the future, once they really know what's going on, they can come back, take over, remake North Korea, and bring it into the 21st century. There was a flaw in the plan. Kim Il-sung, second generation, died too soon. Kim Jong-un and his whole cadre were brought back 15 years too early, and at the tender age of 26, he took over. The second generation were unceremoniously shoved to the side. Consider the world from Kim Jong-un's point of view. The first generation is serious. They really do want you to remake the country, but not until they're all gone. And if you move too fast, the first generation was willing to off your grandfather. They have no problem rubbing you out. The second generation, they want you dead now because you just took all of their jobs, their power, their prestige. So what do? You appear erratic. You shell the odd South Korean city. You lob the odd missile over Japan. You have this crazy nuclear program, and it's all designed to keep everybody at home off base and never know what you're going to do next. And every time a member of the second generation is so stupid as to wander in front of an anti-aircraft cannon, you hit that button. And you purge whoever you can of the second generation whenever you can. So his uncles, his half-brothers, they're all fair game. But at some point in the not-too-distant future, there has to be a night of long knives where you kill every single remaining member of the first and second generation at the same time. And if you miss one, you're dead. Worst job ever. Problem with his plan. Someone on the outside noticed. And he found himself in a Twitter war with Donald Trump. It had never occurred to him that this nuclear stuff could ever cause a problem. So he recalled his diplomatic corps last November. It's only like 30 people. North Koreans, they're not really big on diplomacy. And he sent them to Europe to ask two simple questions. Number one, is Trump nuts? And number two, is Trump serious? And the Europeans are like, what, you moron! It's like he just walked away from 70 years of alliance. You think he cares at all about you? Yes, he's serious. He's like, oh, crap. So you'll notice since November, there's been one Twitter war. And it started when he said, well, you know, we got a nuclear weapon and we're good and secure and we're not going to proceed with any more tests because we don't need to. We got everything we need. In fact, I got my nuclear button right here on my desk. It works. And of course, that started a Twitter war. My button's bigger. Odds are, it's totally internal. It's a dynastic family struggle. It's not about us. The problem that they're going to have now is that we have noticed. It's not something that's just going to vanish from American political thought. Look at what happens. This is from the known North Korean missile sites, flight lines going to North America. There are two things that the United States can do about this. Number one, we can hit all the sites. We can destroy the nuclear program with weapons. We cannot do that with conventional weapons. Forget their air defenses, not that they're insignificant. The issue is that the nuclear program is too dispersed, it's too advanced, it's too entrenched, it's too fortified. We cannot break it with conventional weapons. We would have to use nukes, multiple nukes on multiple sites. We have to glass the country. That's option one. Option two, ring the Korean Peninsula with sufficient strike capability and sufficient NMD capability that whenever something is launched, we have a potential to shoot it down, and then we launch a more conventional strike in there and glass whatever happens to be at the launch site. So make it so they can't ever get any more data on anything. Here's the problem with that. These are the flight paths from the Chinese known emplacements. Notice the overlap. Anything the US now does either eliminates China's only ally or eliminates the effectiveness of the Chinese nuclear deterrent. There is a reason why the Chinese all of a sudden have been more cooperative on this topic. Of course, it ultimately, in the end, hasn't mattered all that much because the Russians have just stepped in and supplied everything to the North Koreans that the Chinese have stopped. But that's kind of where we are right now. It's not about us. We are not in immediate danger. This is China's problem. These are good things. You guys are shy. All right, thank you very much.